For 12 years, I walked the line between life and death, craving nothing but peace. They came to steal it, never realizing they were walking onto my battlefield. The thing about soil is, it holds memories. Every morning, when I'd walk out onto my porch with a steaming mug of coffee, I could feel them. I could feel the sweat of my great-grandfather, a freedman who bought this very plot of land, with calloused hands and a spirit that wouldn't break. I could feel my grandfather's hope as he planted the pecan grove that now shaded my house. I could feel my father's pride, teaching me how to read the clouds and listen to the earth. This land wasn't just dirt and crops to me. It was my lineage, my inheritance, my peace. After 12 years in the teams, peace was the only thing I craved. The dust of Afghanistan and the salt of a dozen unnamed seas had been washed away by the simple, honest work of tilling this Georgia clay. I was a farmer now. That's all I wanted to be. The trouble started slowly, like a sickness in the ground. It started with Jedediah Miller. His family owned the adjacent 1,000 acres, and they'd owned it since before the war, the one with the cannons and the blue coats. He'd drive by in his lifted Ford, slowing down just enough for me to see the sneer on his face. Then one day, he stopped. He leaned out his window, a wad of tobacco bulging in his cheek. "Coal," he grunted, not as a greeting, but as a statement of fact. "That new survey the county did. It seems you've got about 50 acres of my property on your side of that old fence." I just took a slow sip of my water, letting the sun beat down on my neck. "Jed, that fence was put up by your great-grandfather and mine. It's been the line for a century and a half. There's no dispute." He spat a brown stream onto the dust of my driveway. "Times change. Paper is paper. That fence is just rotten wood. We'll be sending someone over to mark the proper line soon." He didn't wait for a response, just gunned his engine and peeled away, leaving a cloud of red dust and resentment hanging in the air. That was the first move. The next few weeks were a campaign of whispers and shadows. My fences were cut, letting my livestock wander. Someone dumped a bag of lye near my well, which I fortunately spotted before it could poison the water table. Little things meant to unnerve me, meant to make me feel isolated, unwelcome. I saw the way folks in town started looking at me. The friendly nods turned into quick glances away. The cashier at the feed store suddenly couldn't make eye contact. Jed Miller was poisoning more than my well. He was poisoning my community against me. I fixed the fences. I reinforced the well cover. I stayed calm. I faced down men with far more than a bad attitude and a pickup truck. I know how to read a threat environment. I know how to wait. I thought if I just kept my head down, worked my land, and showed them I wasn't going to be rattled, they'd eventually get bored and move on. I was wrong. They weren't getting bored. They were getting organized. The night it all came to a head, the sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. I heard them before I saw them. The low growl of a dozen diesel engines rumbling up my long gravel driveway. I stepped out onto the porch, leaving the screen door to swing shut behind me. It wasn't just Jed this time. A convoy of trucks, a constellation of angry headlights, blocked the entrance to my home. They killed their engines, and the sudden silence was more menacing than the noise. Doors opened. About 15, maybe 20 men piled out. They were farmers, mechanics, and barflies, faces I recognized from town. They carried tire irons, heavy chains, and a few had hunting rifles slung over their shoulders, held just a little too casually. Jed Miller stood in front, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, like a king reviewing his troops. "Cole," he boomed, his voice echoing in the twilight. "We're here to reclaim what's ours. This is your last chance. Pack your bags and walk away. We'll even be neighborly and give you till sunrise." I didn't move. I didn't speak. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't shaking. In fact, a strange, cold calm washed over me. The farmer was gone. The man standing on that porch was someone they had never met. My eyes weren't looking at them as a mob of angry neighbors. I was assessing. Jedediah Miller, age 50, overweight, primary instigator, unarmed but positioned as the leader. To his right, 2 men, the Henderson brothers, armed with tire irons, clearly followers. In the back, by the 3rd truck, a man named Peters, holding a Remington 700. He was nervous, shifting his weight foot to foot. He was the biggest threat. My mind mapped it all out in a split second. Exit vectors, weapon priorities, engagement sequence. Jed took their silence, my silence, as fear. He swaggered forward, up the porch steps, until he was just inches from my face. He reeked of cheap whiskey and entitlement. "What's the matter, boy?" he snarled, poking a thick finger into my chest. "Cat got your tongue?" My hand moved. It wasn't a punch or a shove or anything they would have expected. It was faster than a blink, a precise and fluid motion I'd drilled 1,000 times in the kill house. I didn't grab his jabbing finger. I bypassed it, my fingers wrapping around his wrist, my thumb finding the exact pressure point where the radial nerve runs close to the bone. I squeezed. It wasn't a gesture of anger. It was a simple, biomechanical command. Jed's eyes went wide. The smirk on his face dissolved into a mask of pure, agonizing shock. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, and his entire body went rigid, his jabbing hand frozen in place by an invisible fire. The rest of the mob fell silent, their bravado evaporating as they watched their leader suddenly neutralized, without a single blow being thrown. I held his gaze, my voice dropping to a low, quiet timbre that carried across the yard with chilling clarity. "You have no idea who I am," I said softly, still holding Jed in a grip of surgical pain. "But you're about to find out. This is your one and only warning. Get off my property." I released Jed's wrist as suddenly as I'd grabbed it. He stumbled back down the porch steps, clutching his arm, his face a mottled canvas of rage and disbelief. The pain had subsided, but the humiliation was just setting in. He looked at his hand like it had been bitten by a snake. The rest of the men shifted on their feet, their drunken bravado curdling into confusion. They had come for a fight, for an easy intimidation of a lone black man, but this silent, surgical display of control was something they hadn't factored into their plans. They were a pack of dogs that had just watched their alpha get put down with a flick of the wrist. "You broke it," Jed wheezed, cradling his arm. "You broke my damn wrist." "No," I said, my voice still level, still calm. "If I'd broken it, you'd be unconscious. It's just a reminder of the difference between your world and mine. Now take your friends and go home." My eyes flicked back to Peters, the nervous man with the Remington. He was the weak link, the one most likely to do something stupid out of fear. He saw me looking, and his grip tightened on the rifle stock. The Henderson brothers, the ones with the tire irons, took a half step forward, trying to recapture some of their lost nerve. "There's 20 of us and one of you," one of them growled, spitting on the ground. It was a bluff, and we both knew it. Mob courage is a fragile thing. I ignored him and kept my gaze locked on Peters. "Son," I said, my voice cutting through the evening air, "you're holding that rifle to protect your friends, but all you're doing is making yourself the primary target. You have no idea how fast a man can cross 20 yards. Do you really want to bet your life on your ability to pull that trigger before I can get to you?" A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. His eyes darted from me to Jed and back again. He was looking for an order, for permission, but his leader was still gasping for air and nursing his wounded pride. That hesitation was all I needed. I didn't run. I moved. It was the explosive, controlled burst of energy they teach you for clearing a room. 3 long, ground-eating strides, closing the distance while their brains were still processing my words. Peters's eyes widened in panic. He fumbled to raise the rifle, but it was far too late. My left hand came up, deflecting the barrel skyward as my right hand slammed into the side of his neck, right on the brachial plexus. His entire arm went numb, his fingers spasming open. The Remington fell from his grasp. I caught it before it hit the ground, spun it, worked the bolt to eject the chambered round, and tossed the now safe weapon into the high weeds beside the driveway. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds. I stood over a wheezing, collapsing Peters. The ejected brass cartridge glinted in the dust at my feet. The rest of the mob was frozen solid, statues of impotent rage. I hadn't just disarmed them, I had dismantled their entire reality. The world they knew, where numbers and loud voices and the threat of violence won every argument, had just been turned upside down. I turned slowly, letting my eyes pass over every single one of them. "I will say this one last time," I said. The farmer's patience gone, replaced by the commander's finality. "Get off my land. The next time you come here, don't bring tire irons and rifles. Bring a hearse." That did it. The spell was broken. They backed away, a stumbling, muttering retreat. They helped a groaning Peters to his feet and practically carried a still fuming Jedediah Miller to his truck. Engines sputtered to life, one by one. Headlights cut through the darkness as they turned and fled down my driveway, leaving me alone in a cloud of their exhaust and failure. I stood on my porch for a long time, listening as the sound of their engines faded into the chirping of the crickets. The peace of my home had been violated, but for now, it was mine again. I was turning to go inside when a new set of lights appeared at the end of the road. These weren't the harsh beams of pickup trucks. They were the rhythmic, flashing red and blue of a patrol car. It pulled up slowly, its tires crunching on the gravel. The driver's side door opened, and Sheriff Brody heaved himself out. He was a man well into his 60s, with a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform and a face lined with the weariness of small-town politics. "Evening, Cole," he said, adjusting his belt. "Heard there was a bit of a commotion out here." "It's over, Sheriff," I said, my posture relaxing slightly. "Jed Miller and some of his friends stopped by for a chat. They've left." Brody ambled closer, his eyes scanning the tire tracks, the discarded brass casing, the general disarray. "A chat, huh?" Looked more like a party from the line of trucks I saw heading back to town. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, not quite meeting my eyes. "Listen, son, I've known your family my whole life. Your daddy was a good man. You need to understand. Things are different now. Jed Miller, he's got powerful friends. Stirring up a hornet's nest like this, it ain't gonna end well for you. He came onto my property with 20 armed men to try and run me off my own land," I said, my voice hardening. "What would you have me do, Sheriff?" He sighed, finally looking up at me. There was no support in his eyes, only a weary resignation. "This ain't about that old fence line anymore, Cole. You're thinking too small." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to me. "A courier dropped this at my office right before closing. It's a copy. The original was filed with the county clerk this morning. You're about to have a much bigger problem than Jed Miller's bruised ego." I took the paper and unfolded it under the dim glow of the porch light. It was thick, official, covered in legalese and county seals. My eyes scanned the text, catching phrases that made my blood run cold. "In accordance with state law, eminent domain, preliminary seizure notice." At the bottom, a paragraph outlined the justification. They weren't just claiming a 50-acre strip. They were claiming my entire farm, from the pecan grove to the riverbed. And the reason? To make way for a necessary public utility. My farm, my family's legacy, was being condemned to build a private access road for the Miller Agricultural Corporation's new distribution center. I stared at the paper in my hand, the crisp legal jargon feeling more alien than any foreign dialect I'd ever encountered. This was a different kind of weapon, one you couldn't disarm or outflank. It was a snake made of paper and ink, and it was coiled to strike at the very heart of my existence. Sheriff Brody just stood there, his expression a mask of practiced neutrality. He wasn't the law. He was just the messenger for men like Jed Miller. "I'll see you in court, Sheriff," I said, folding the paper neatly and handing it back to him. He shook his head, a gesture of pity that made my blood boil. "You can't fight City Hall, son, let alone the Miller Corporation. They own the judges, the commissioners. They own this whole county." He turned to leave. "Just be smart about this, Cole, for your father's memory." I watched him drive away, his flashing lights disappearing into the night. He was wrong. They didn't own me, and they didn't know the first thing about fighting a war. They thought they were fighting a farmer. They were about to learn what it means to go up against an entire team, even if that team was just one man and the ghosts he carried with him. For the next 2 weeks, I was quiet. To the town, it must have looked like I'd accepted my fate. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't protest. I just worked my land, rising with the sun and sleeping with the moon. But my real work began after dark. The farm became my operations base. I made one phone call to a number I hadn't dialed in 5 years. "Sparky," I said when a voice answered. "I need a ghost." A chuckle on the other end. "Who are we haunting this time, Cole?" I explained the situation. Jed Miller, the Miller Corporation, the eminent domain claim, the corrupt county commissioner, a man named Henderson whose nephews had been holding the tire irons. Sparky, our team's tech wizard, listened without interruption. When I was done, there was a pause. "Eminent domain for a private access road? That's sloppy," he said. "There has to be a payoff. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours later, my email inbox pinged with a heavily encrypted file. It contained offshore bank statements, phone records, and blueprints. The private access road was a lie. The seizure of my land was phase 1 of a much larger plan to rezone the entire area for a massive commercial development. A project that would make Miller and Commissioner Henderson millions. My farm wasn't in the way. It was the keystone. And the file contained the wire transfer confirmation from a Miller Shell Corporation to Henderson's consulting firm in the Cayman Islands. Sparky hadn't just found a ghost, he'd found the murder weapon. The town hall meeting was packed. It was supposed to be a formality, the final public hearing before they rubber-stamped the seizure. Jed Miller was there, his wrist in a brace, looking smug. Commissioner Henderson sat at the head of the table, radiating false gravitas. They went through the motions, talking about progress, jobs, and the greater good. They called my name, asking if I had anything to say before the final vote. I walked to the podium at the front of the room. The air was thick with a mix of pity and contempt. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, the men who had stood in my driveway ready to do violence. "Commissioner Henderson," I began, my voice calm and steady. "You've spoken a lot about the public good. Mr. Miller has spoken about the needs of the community." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "I believe it's only fair that you tell the community the whole story." Henderson started to speak, but the 2 large television screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the county seal, suddenly flickered to life. A bank statement appeared on screen, showing a deposit of $250,000 into an offshore account. Then an audio file began to play, piped directly through the room's speaker system. It was Jed Miller's voice, rough and arrogant. "Don't worry about the farmer," his voice echoed through the shocked silence. "Once the board approves the seizure, he's got nothing. Brody will drag him off the property himself if he has to." Then Henderson's voice slick and conspiratorial. "And the 250 is just the first payment? My vote doesn't come cheap, Jed. Once we break ground, you'll be a rich man," Miller's voice promised. "That land is worth 10 times what we're paying for it. Just gotta get rid of that stubborn." He used a word then, a vile racial slur that sucked all the air out of the room. Chaos erupted. People were shouting, pointing. Henderson's face went white as a sheet, while Jed Miller looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Sheriff Brody, standing in the back, just stared at the floor, his face ashen. He knew. He had known all along. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I just walked out of the town hall and drove home. The next morning I was on my porch with my coffee, just like always. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the pecan grove. The soil felt different today, calmer. I saw a truck coming up my driveway. It wasn't a convoy this time, just a single, beat-up Chevy. One of the Henderson brothers, the ones with the tire irons, got out. He stood by his truck for a long moment, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. He finally walked over to the bottom of my steps. He didn't look at me, just at the ground. "My uncle's been arrested," he mumbled. "The feds are all over Miller's offices. They're saying they're going to dissolve the corporation." He finally looked up, and I saw shame in his eyes. We were wrong, Mr. Cole. I'm sorry." I just nodded, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Get on home, son." He nodded back, turned, and left. I watched him go, then turned my gaze back to my land. This place was my peace, and I had fought a war for it. I had faced down bullies, mobs, and corruption, not with the tools of a SEAL, but with the unyielding spirit my great-grandfather had planted in this soil a century and a half ago. The memories in this ground weren't just of hardship and struggle anymore. They were memories of victory. And the peace that settled over me then wasn't the peace of a man in hiding from the world. It was the peace of a man who knew exactly where he belonged.